And thanks for joining us, the first panel of day 2. I know it can be a struggle. So the first panel that we're kicking off with is on the topic of project funding and finance. So I'll just give a quick overview of that and then kick over to the panelists. But yesterday, it felt like we talked about a lot of really interesting projects and ideas, and we touched on finance a little bit, but the idea of today's first panel is really to dig into how do we get money to those projects. And on this panel, we have some representation across the actual investment side to the project side, so I think it's a really good representation of that sort of value chain. I'll introduce myself, and then I'll introduce the rest of the panel, or I'll kick over so they can introduce themselves. So I'm Lourie. I'm the Director of Natural Climate Solutions and Aviation at AIDA, the International Emissions Trading Association. And so maybe I'll just start in order of the sofa lineup here. But Elvy, can you introduce yourself, your company, your role, and why you're interested in the subject of this conference and the panel today?
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Elvy Barton. I'm a Forest Health Management Principal at Salt River Project. We also go by SRP. SRP is a power and water provider in the Phoenix metropolitan area, and that's in Arizona. And we serve about 2.5 million customers in that area. But one of the things about the water side of our company is that the water that we deliver to our customer derives from 3 watersheds across 8.3 million acres. And there's a large portion of those 3 watersheds that are completely unhealthy and at risk of catastrophic wildfire and post-wildfire flooding. So knowing that this was the greatest risk to delivering water supplies to 2.5 million people, our company in 2009 passed a forest health goal to help thin and restore 500,000 acres of forest across these watersheds by 2035. And so that's where I come into this picture, where I lead all of our efforts in terms of helping bring projects to the table, bringing partners and financing to the table, and ensuring that we can reach our 2035 goal to restore those forested lands across our watersheds and continue delivering on our mission, which is what brings me here today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elvy. Sam, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Sam Frankel. I'm the Managing Director of EP Carbon. We're a carbon technical services provider. We work with the implementers of projects to help them access carbon finance and reach issuance. We've been around in the market for about 15 years. We've developed over 40 projects in a variety of standards and methodologies, and any number of other feasibility studies and other efforts in project development. Our roots are in the early days of the VCS RED market and working as a technical service provider with a lot of early RED projects. Over time, we've actually worked with and helped to develop 3 of the 6 lighthouse projects that were recognized as highest quality under VCS. When the California climate market kind of got up and running in the mid-2000s, we shifted and did a lot of work in IFM under that market, developed a lot of projects on the west coast of the US and Canada with Native American tribes. And then in 2020, we spun off our sister company named Forest Carbon Works that has a focus on North American IFM and ARR projects, and EP Carbon really returned in force to the voluntary carbon market, RED, ARR, blue carbon, and so on. We provide a development pathway that begins with project design, classic feasibility studies, another way of assessing a project, a de-risking process to help projects become better able to access carbon finance, also better able to become stable long-term players in the market. And then finally, development services. We work with projects to build their PDDs, monitoring reports, and be stable and issue credits over many years. So very glad to be here today, and I'll pass it to the next person.
Great, thank you. Hi everybody, my name is Matt Stone. So I am the Managing Director of Prima, which is a company that specialises in data and analytics, traditionally for the biofuel markets and the feedstock markets, So we're very much integrated into the physical world of decarbonisation and value chain mitigation. We recently joined the ResourceWise group of companies, so we're now integrating into a universe which is rich in data and information about forestry, everything that you could ever want to know about the landscape of forestry and petrochemicals, and tying that together with what we're doing in the feedstock markets for low carbon fuels. And again, that's now morphing into all of these areas such as the development of synthetic fuels, loads of other very scalable solutions which are in their early stages. So we have, I think, a slightly different perspective to bring to the table to the offset world, but it's all part of the same matrix, and there's huge areas of overlap and potential opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to being able to explore all of that type of stuff on this panel.
Zach, go ahead. Thanks.
And I'm Zach Goldstein. I'm with Aspiration. I'm the head of investments. Historically, Aspiration has been a consumer finance product in the climate space, but more recently we've focused on deploying capital as more of an asset manager. I and my team work to source early stage project finance opportunities with developers and development teams, and we also work to place the offsets that we are obtaining with enterprise customers of ours. We have a monitoring and engagement team. My team has people who focus on the markets, the opportunities themselves, structuring, analysis, as well as folks who help our offsets find the right buyers for those attributes. And I come from a conventional project finance background.
Great, thanks very much to the panelists for describing your role in this sort of broader market. I think we can start with our first question, which I think of as kind of a fundamental question for this whole conference, which is how do we get traditional investors to invest in carbon, which is, I mean, that's kind of why we're all here. So I think, Zach, maybe we'll start with you and then welcome others to chime in.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I started my career as a project finance attorney and then moved to being an investor. And I think with any project finance market, you need to figure out, make this look more and more like what the investors who already do this are used to, because project capital is going to be eventually more inexpensive capital, it'll move earlier, and it'll enable more projects. It's also understanding what project investors need to see, what they believe they need to see, and what they, I don't want to say lie to themselves about, because that's too pejorative, but sort of the myths you will tell yourself. For example, the fundamental, if you read Yescombe's Principles of Project Finance, which is sort of every project finance professional should have that near or adjacent to their desk. It starts with the offtake contract, your source of offtake. And every project finance banker will tell you, I need a firm offtake contract. But if you look at what they've financed recently, that hasn't always been as true. And the example I always like to use for what this looks like to me, because I come from renewables, it looks a little bit like community solar. And community solar projects, initially it was hard to get them financed, and then everybody said, well, no, you have a subscription manager in place, and that person will solve my offtake problem. That person is getting you one-year offtake subscriptions. So when a project finance person says to me, oh, these are voluntary offsets, someone could just decide they don't want them, I will say, well, no, they're signing a pretty firm offtake agreement, and your whole community solar portfolio is full of people who could decide they don't want this. They have the same commitment to you that I have to The Economist. I mean, it's a little more serious than that. I'm being slightly glib. So, working with, as we try to unlock conventional infrastructure investing capital in this market, there are risks that you're going to have to get these investors comfortable with, but there are also risks they're already taking that look as risky as this, riskier than this. And it's sort of having a frank conversation about those. Because if it's not what you're familiar with, I get that there's some hesitancy about that, but calling that underwriting is a little different. I live in New York City. A lot of my team live on the West Coast. Earthquakes scare the hell out of me. I would never live somewhere where there's earthquakes. They don't mind. Snow frightens them. And are those rational choices? No, it's just I'm used to underwriting my exposure to snow. I have boots. Like, so I think we need to, I don't know that we need to approach this by telling infrastructure investors, ha, you big losers, you already take this risk. You're just being big babies about this. But there does need to be a process of educating these folks that this isn't that different. Project finance markets have gotten comfortable. Any risk that comes up in offsets, we need to stop thinking that this is that new. Emerging markets risk. We've done emerging markets projects before. This isn't that new. We just need to remember how we got comfortable with it that time. I'll stop now, but I could do a whole tight 10 on this.
Thanks, Zach. No, I really appreciate that perspective. You said you were going to bring some spice, and I think we can already
That was too much, wasn't it?
No, it was good.
I didn't get here in time for coffee, I'm sorry.
Sam, did you want to come in on that same question? How do we get traditional investors into carbon?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. The perspective that we have at EP Carbon, we're working with the project developers or project implementers, and so we're kind of seeing things from their vantage point, sort of from that field-based view. How do we move this project to the next stage? Very much playing off Zach's riff, we focus a lot on systematic, what we call systematic de-risking through the different phases. So, traditional in the field has been that like feasibility study that sort of purports to answer all the questions and whatnot. And it's great. It provides, terrific information about the both eligibility, viability, and adds important details like these are, important safeguards that may need to be addressed before a project is really ready for the market. So what we try to do is then work in a phase after that with the project so that we're looking at what are the major risks that a assessment has uncovered, and how can we provide a risk mitigation plan so that we can communicate better with a more traditional investor and say, yes, these may have risks that you've experienced in the past, but look at the work we're doing to try to address those and sort of try to handle that objection a little bit in advance, and genuinely build up the capacity of the project to deal with some of the risks that do exist in this field. So we try to approach it from the kind of project side, reaching toward that hand from the more traditional investor.
Great. Thanks very much, Sam. And then, Elvy, so we've kind of heard the investment perspective and then the sort of middle ground sort of, broker
exactly.
perspective. And so the project perspective, Elvy, it'd be great if you could sort of bring in that perspective to answer the question, how are you attracting investment into your carbon projects?
So in our forestry project, the watersheds that we operate in are primarily federal or tribal lands. And so that brings a little bit element of complication and nuance that we also have to address. But I think the number one thing that we really try to tackle in this sphere is scale. Because when you scale the projects to large projects, you also bring a large amount of benefits as opposed to like 100 acre or 200 acre projects where we now have 100,000 acres under agreements with the federal government and the state of Arizona that we're going to work on over the next 10 years. So that not only shows the amount of projects that we can do, but also the scale to our investors. So if they want to get in early with an off-ground project, try doing a pilot or a feasibility, they can. And if they like what they see, they can continue moving forward. The other thing that we've really done a lot of work on in this space is the combining of co-benefits. So we know that forestry projects in the western United States to reduce wildfire and protect watersheds can be quite expensive depending on where you live and the amount of industry that you have in place to be your offtake partner in terms of the lumber. But what we have noticed is that when you pair carbon and water benefits together, then you can actually attract a significant amount of investments into your forestry projects that are to scale. And so we have developed models with the recent local universities to quantify the amount of water benefits associated with our forest restoration projects. And we also used carbon methodologies that are approved through Climate Forward to actually calculate the carbon benefits of our projects. And so when we combine those two, it actually creates a significant investment for corporate entities that have those type of metrics and are looking for those type of investments across our watersheds. And so that's how we've been able to attract some traditional corporate investors into our projects.
Thanks very much for that. Elvy. Maybe just over to you, Matt, for your perspective on this.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that we see, and we're working with companies that range from companies that are involved in physical decarbonised low carbon feedstocks through to biofuels, whether that's for road transportation or aviation, through to new solutions such as synthetic fuels. And the general need is the same. So there's an exponential demand from companies to decarbonise their inputs. So within the same universe, they have a need for offsets. They also have a need for inputs which are non-fossil. And that comes back to the really important point that ultimately something like 65% of global emissions derive in one way or another from petroleum fuels. So what these companies are looking to do is they know that they've got a framework of milestones to hit with solutions which are going to, in a meaningful way, reduce their emissions from Scope 1 to Scope 3. So when they look at that, what they're trying to do is understand pathways in terms of whether or not they make sense. So we're talking about a market which is philosophical in concept, which is a very difficult thing, I think, for conventional commodity companies to grasp. They're used to dealing with energy products in terms of standardized factors like energy content, sulfur content. So coming into this new world, they want to look at, do we want to invest in this particular renewable pathway in terms of its ESG credentials? Okay, we do. How much is it going to cost? And that's a very difficult question to answer, particularly in emerging technologies. You can get a range of different answers. But then the one thing that they always come back to is we're a business. Businesses need to ultimately, at the end of the day, make things work for them economically. And then you're looking at your return. And then we get into this really, really interesting point, which is there are a myriad of different carbon prices. So in the offset world, speaking to people here, you see carbon prices ranging from $2.40 to $12 to $15 to $140 to $750 for a carbon removal project. And that's very difficult, I think, for companies to get their head round in terms of how do we make this work. So again, coming at this from the physical world of decarbonisation, so we look at the landscape for low carbon fuels worldwide, and actually the numbers tie back in the physical world to a pretty consistent level of around, I don't know, $250, $300, $350 a tonne for physical decarbonisation, which is obviously a lot different to the kind of prices that we're talking about in most of the offset markets. But with that kind of information, we have a really good steer for companies to be able to start to plan project finance based on those numbers. And then you can model where you think the carbon price is going to go based on shifts in policy, growth in demand, buyout mechanisms, all of this type of stuff. So that, I think, is an approach which is helping the supply side to navigate its way to ultimately increasing the elasticity of supply. And then the other really interesting thing that's going on at the moment is the urgency from the buy side to be able to consume this stuff outstrips possibly any other impetus in the market. So if you look at the really big blue chip companies in the world, the message that you get from them is they're desperate to park money in solutions, but they don't have a clear way of doing it. So there are some initiatives which are coming together to try and help buyers cluster together to aim money at areas of the supply side which are actually going to be able to deliver. But this is all in its infancy. There's still a long way to go, and all of these types of project finance issues will be involved in making those capital allocation decisions.
Can I actually jump on that?
Please
I know
do, yeah.
It's going to go off script. Gets real. One thing I want to come on the back of that, one thing that does make your offtake product unique here, these are a little bespoke. Projects are different. They can be priced on Opus, sure, but like, if there's you're not just, for people who are trying, if you're at a corporation, maybe you're not an expert at this, sometimes happens, and you've been tasked with doing this, and you need to think of an intelligent way to do this. One thing that makes this a little weird is, if you do this poorly, not only did you fail to buy an asset, you bought a liability. You bought headline risk. You bought SEC reporting. You bought all these horrible things because you cut a corner you didn't know you were cutting. You didn't fully grasp the issues. You didn't partner correctly. And so I don't envy the folks in corporate America who've been tasked with this, because making sure there was a skit I remember about a person at the UN who's been put in charge of hiring translators, and they only speak English. So every translator can say, well, I speak every language on earth, because they have no way of knowing. Like, if you're covering this and you need to say, are these good partners? Are these good offsets? Is the work being done thoughtfully? Is there community buy-in? Am I checking that in a way that will confirm what I'm being told is correct? And if it's not correct, who is stepping in to say, I've got your back, you won't have exposure to this? So that makes this, turning that and those challenges into a long-term offtake solution is something that is a little unique. It's something that we're working to control for our partners as part of our pitch, is that we will make sure this doesn't happen to you. Because John Oliver does a piece on offsets. It's glib, it's superficial. He doesn't mention that they're good. He's a comedian. He's there to write from a comedic standpoint. And it pains me. I've had to stop watching his show. But the headline risk is real, and there's a real risk to getting it wrong. And that's something that we want. We don't want to see anyone who works with us get burned by this. We want to see everyone who wants to do this and is serious about it do it well. And the people who don't do it seriously, we'd like to bring them back. Pain is a powerful teacher, and we'd like them to take as little as possible. But
Yeah, no, thanks, Zach. And that seems like it was off script, but actually you've teed us up really well for the next question, which is about de-risking. So you've kind of outlined all the risks, which is fantastic. And we've also heard from everyone else and you on sort of how do we get that finance into carbon. But now we're going to, dial into the de-risking. So maybe I'll pass it to you, Sam, for this question first, and then welcome others to chime in. But so how do project developers de-risk projects to get corporate investors to say yes to that project?
Yeah. Well, on the plus side, I think there's a strong resonance with how Zach was phrasing it, where risk mitigation and project quality often go hand in hand. So what we expect to see based on the desired growth of this field, but also those risks that you mentioned, is we expect to see a real emphasis on offset quality, or the quality of the project that is delivering the offsets. And so when we talk about risk mitigation, we're also talking about how do we improve the quality of the project from different lenses. That can be based on just a high degree of integrity in the accounting, the alignment with the standard and methodology, but also in the design so that it is clear and defensible. That can involve the co-benefits that Elvy mentioned, and an increasingly kind of granular focus on co-benefits. There are some things that, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but kind of check a box, like does it have a co-benefit standard, and that's great, but how can we better reflect the real impacts on top of the climate impact of a project? And if that is clear in a project's design and delivery, and then the asset that it's delivering to the market, a project that can demonstrate a clear co-benefit impact is also addressing a lot of quality concerns and also risks. So if a project has risks of delivery, risks of activity success, things like that, that could be an indication that the project hasn't connected the dots thoroughly enough in its planning stages on, is this a set of activities that is going to have climate impact, but also value to the other stakeholders in the project. And so that's where we would work with projects at the design and the risk mitigation phase to make sure that those connections are clear, and then the offset that's delivered can bring all those benefits in a potentially a very tangible way.
Thanks for that, Sam. Elvy, you talked a lot about co-benefits in the first response to the first question. So do you want to add to that idea of co-benefits as a way of de-risking?
Definitely. So I would say the first thing is the scale, back to the scale thing. So when you have a lot of projects that are very similar to each other and you have that scale, one of the things that we do with our partners is we essentially create a risk pool of projects and co-benefits. So that way we say essentially, if you invest in this project at this amount, then we will have a backing in that and a risk pool in case the co-benefits aren't generated to the amount that we are monitoring on this, or there's something happens with that project, we will back it with this other project that is in the same landscape, same type of co-benefits calculated the same way. So that is definitely one way that we de-risk our projects to our investors. And then the second one is that we're sort of a unique entity. We're considered like a kind of like a political subdivision of the state. So we're kind of like a local government. And we have the ability to float the funding for our projects. So we prepay all our projects, and we usually just have our corporate investors sign agreements with us ahead of time saying that they will reimburse us over time, and we can structure that however that corporate entity needs to account for that, not only in their budget cycles, but as the project progresses over time as well. So that way you can essentially almost pay for once that project is completed, and that way you don't really have to put that upfront funding because our organization does that ahead of time. So that's another way of just providing additional de-risking factors to our project.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd love to kind of pick up on that because I think that touches something that we see a lot, that ways to catalyze early activities. I mean, you mentioned having the facility in your organization to kind of like sort of do the work, deliver the benefit, and then receive the payment. Paraphrasing, of course, but what we see when we're working on different kinds of sort of Red Plus oriented projects is that you can have a very strong concept, very strong community support, and that can kind of theoretically be a great project. But what can really catalyze it and take a lot of the risk out is relatively modest early funding to initiate activities such that people are receiving benefits, sort of there's proof of concept of the rewards to people, and then sort of that, in a sense, that kind of social contract to limit kind of degradation of the carbon pools. And so where there is the ability to provide that kind of catalyzing funding, that can go hand in hand with delivering a high quality project that is lower risk because its activity implementation has either been done or at least has been done at sort of a proof of concept ready to scale stage. And we see that a lot on kind of more on the international side.
If I can just jump in on that as well. So I think there's an analogy here from the renewable fuel market. So that's been going for a while. I mean, in the US and Europe, it's been going for 20 odd years. And again, it's a market where people started off trading commodities and became very used to trading premiums and discounts. And the level of premiums and discounts that people have grown used to trading in the market has mushroomed. And I think that's a way that people can try and get their heads around the differentiation between projects. So what's important to us? What's important to the frameworks that we're trying to operate in? Can we put a value on that? When you've put a value on it, how do you then stay on top of the project to make sure that it's meeting that value that's been put onto it? And again, to come back to renewable fuels, that's an auditing and data job. You've got to have good data, and then ultimately the data has got to have integrity. And we've seen this time and time again. The problem is either when the data's lacking, or even worse, and this comes back to the John Oliver problem, you have no integrity in the data, and then you've got a really big problem because you've basically sunk confidence in what you're trying to do. So another aspect of the value proposition here is brand risk. We're doing this thing. Does it make sense? Can we make it stack up? Can we sit on top of it to make sure all the stuff that we want to be delivered is delivered? And ultimately, what's the cost to us if that doesn't work? Because then there's another factor that you can put into the economics of what you're trying to do.
I do want to jump in on what Sam said, though, because you talked about coming in early with small amounts of capital. To do that, certain things like community buy-in are delicate. And you need a strong stomach to do this. Because if you come into a project early, you're going to get the kind of fun emails where it's like, apparently the community is upset. Some people in the community are not happy. And at that moment, you're going to need the presence of mind to say, all right, don't panic. Let's investigate this. Let's see exactly what's being alleged. Let's make sure we have the right people on the ground looking into it. And getting yourself comfortable that this is a drop in that this isn't real, this is motivated by something else, or this is a real concern that needs to be addressed. So you need the presence of mind to not just think, oh, all is lost, let's get out of here. I have a system for figuring out if this is actually a problem and a system for mitigating that. And when the earlier you come in, the more likelihood there is that something like this will happen. And you need to be prepared and staffed and mentally ready to do this. I've rarely, in renewables, I don't know that just in life, I don't know that I've ever had a community where 100% of the people have been happy about everything that happens in that community all the time. They're putting in a playground for children. Boo, children, yuck. These are complicated. These involve engaging a lot of stakeholders, getting them to a point where they're consistently happy or pleased with what you're doing. And not everyone's going to voice that, but if you've dotted your I's, crossed your T's, and are confident that you're proceeding properly from a project standpoint, you will have the confidence to underwrite that exposure, which is a very weird thing to talk to most infrastructure investors about.
It comes back to this is like a more specific definition of quality, that amorphous term, and it's quality is where kind of the rubber meets the road. And I hear you guys chuckling, not because I don't like kids, but I'm from a small town in rural Maine, and then I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and I lived in a village in Ghana that was actually bigger than my small town in rural Maine. So small communities or rural communities, no one agrees about everything. That's the reality of it. But then on the kind of the practical project development side, kind of taking seriously this concept of quality in order to deliver that, it's like there's for folks that work in the VCS, Verified Carbon Standard, there are things built into the standard that can seem like they're very dry, but like there's this concept of the grievance mechanism that is a requirement of a VCS project. And it's like, take these things seriously. Like, these have been incorporated into the standards for a reason. And there's a temptation to be like, let's focus on the things that are kind of most immediate, often like the financial yield and things like that. But paying attention early to like what is the grievance mechanism on a project, that helps to address that question of risk and ultimately deliver quality. And so it's like sometimes like the fundamental tenets of the development standards have been grappling with these problems, and we can rely on those and take the value that's been invested in them.
I'm really appreciating the dialogue, and I know Elvy wants to come in too. But just to say to the audience quickly before you come in, Elvy, get your questions ready, because we'll take questions right after Elvy makes her remarks. So go ahead.
Prepare your grievances.
Well, thanks, Zach and Sam. I just wanted to point out that the community buy-in really is a huge issue, especially depending on the land management type that you're going to be investing in those projects. So for example, if it's tribal land or forestry land or state land, those all come with a certain amount of not only environmental compliance, but also community buy-in and how those processes play out. So when you're first looking at the type of projects that you want to invest in, those are some really key questions that we get asked a lot by our investors are like, was this developed through a collaborative process? Who are your stakeholders that you work with? What are the relationships that we have with those individual stakeholders? And can you also show all the environmental compliance, all the work that has been done to shore up that buy-in? And that's a huge thing that I think is really important. The other thing that has most recently also come up for us that we get asked a lot is about the diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how not only us as a company incorporate those principles into our projects, but how we also look at projects through that DEI lens as well and take those individual things into account, and how we are affecting different diverse communities and making sure that those traditionally excluded communities are now being included in some of these projects, and also their voices are being heard as well. So that's another thing that has been brought up more recently with us.
Thanks, Elvy.
Can I just ask a question there? I mean, in terms of like messaging and buy-in, what's the best approach for making, or trying to give this stuff the best chance of going right from the get-go? what should developers be doing on that front?
So from a project perspective, and we kind of play a little bit of each kind of role, is that we are invested in all the stakeholder groups, all the collaboratives. We participate in those. All the stakeholders know who we are, and having those long-standing, trusting relationships are really important. So, and that takes time, honestly. You can't just walk into a room and say, "Hi, I want to invest in your project, and here's my check on the table." You really have to have somebody on the ground in the community that community trusts and can work with.
Okay.
Great. Well, thanks for kicking us off with a question, Matt. And I'll pass to the audience for any questions in the room. I think from the discussion the panel has already had, there's clearly a breadth of experience, and it's been a really grounded conversation about the practicalities of getting finance in, so I think we can learn a lot. Yeah.
Should I speak loudly?
A mic's coming.
Thank you. This is for Elvy. So I don't quite understand, you mentioned carbon benefits and water benefits. If I want to invest $50 million in the Salt River project, do I get a financial return as well? So how do you pay for these restoration activities, and do you generate revenue apart from these very important benefits, carbon and water?
So thank you for that question. So our forestry projects, the revenue that comes from the timber being removed and being sold into the market, all that revenue goes back into the project, and that actually just reduces the cost, and so there's still a net cost associated. So we have an agreement with the federal government that they pay 50% of the cost up front, and that is one of our catalysts that we use to attract additional investment. And then through our agreements, SRP says we will provide the other 50% of the funding, and then we work with our partners on other parts to bring them to invest with us on that 50% part. So we have a guaranteed 50% co-benefit. And then on the other side is we do price water and carbon, and it's associated, it's tied back to what it costs to restore an acre of land. And we can do a return on investment calculation showing that your investment is going to be worth more than the carbon and water benefits are worth more than the actual costs that you put in with us. And with the other way we also shore up the return on investment, we bring additional co-benefits to the table. So there's water quality implications, there's community and infrastructure protection, and there's also biodiversity in terms of wildlife protection and critical habitat for endangered and threatened species that we can also bring to the table for a lot of these projects. So there's a lot of additional co-benefits that we can calculate, which will boost up the return on investment.
Great. Thanks for the question, and thanks for that, Elvy.
Hi. I often hear from investors, how do you manage or ensure longevity of your projects? How do you make sure that after 15 years or 30 years it will be still there, sustainable? So I'm really interested in your view on this.
Anyone want to take?
I'll start, but I'm very happy to then leave it to others. I mean, in some ways, I'm going to pick up again on one of Zach's jokes of like, are these risks really different than other fields? I mean.
Oh man, I was
Oh, okay.
No, do it.
Yeah, okay.
Take it.
So,
I'm so proud.
I'll do a folksy one, and then you
Okay.
can do something else. So,
Not
you know,
folksy.
so why is a convenience store in a small town, there for 25 years or something like that? Like, well, it provides a real service. You need a place to buy gas and milk and things like that. So a well-designed project that's delivering real benefits, in a sense, what greater risk does that have than any business if it's providing real tangible benefits to a community? So kind of back to those co-benefits and things like that. So.
We're going to look at the same thing we looked at in conventional infrastructure too. We're going to look at the nature of the agreements that have been signed and the quality of that. It's the same risk of expropriation that we've always had on other projects. It's the same risk of losing contractors or the quality of your contracts that we've always had. So again, the way you get investors comfortable with that is the same way we did it in other parts of project finance. And I think if we can leverage those skills and learn from it. And it's not going to be one-to-one, I get it, especially with delicate things like community buy-in. But also community buy-in was a thing in conventional project finance. You know how you make sure you don't get expropriated? Make sure the place you are likes you. There are videos on the internet of people developing solar projects I worked on getting screamed at in town halls once that became a thing in this country. So like, it's going to be a combination of the quality of the work you're doing, the quality of the partnerships you have, but it looks a lot like the way we've done it before. So I would put it that way.
And looking at this from the physical world, does it fulfill a need that's still going to be there in 20 years' time? So is it doing something that makes sense that people are going to want? If you're looking at stuff that's dependent on technology, is it likely to be superseded by anything else? So again, it's making the same point, which is stuff changes, so make sure that you've got the frameworks in place to be able to navigate change, but ultimately that you have a product that people are going to still need, or a solution that people are going to still need in 20 years' time.
I'll just add one thing, is that from our perspective, we add monitoring plans to all of our agreements to ensure that the life of your investment is going to be monitored, and that we do provide annual reporting back to ensure that the monitoring is matching the benefits that we have originally agreed to.
There may be one other element to this too, which is kind of addressing critiques of carbon market. I mean, I think a different critique, and this is very much kind of building on your question, not directly, but you know, would be sort of the critique of, is the carbon impact permanent, you know, so to speak. And then again, I think we go back to some of the fundamentals of the standards and methodologies, like the risk pool, you know, is there to provide a backstop in the case of where a project doesn't provide that 25-year convenience store value that I was joking about. So, you know, there are to be mechanisms to account for that as well. But if the system is well designed, we are building those in.
Okay, well, I just got that sign, so I think we have to wrap it up here. But I really appreciate all of the panelists for sharing their views, and thanks to the organizers for having us, and hopefully you can find us, certainly the panelists, in the coffee break. But I know we're setting the tone for the day on punctuality, so I think we'll just wrap it up here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers.